Laurento Mansion. It looks like a dream home. Grand halls, crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of rooms where wealth shines brighter than the sun, but beneath all that sparkle lies a dark truth. At night, the walls whisper about disappearances, about old secrets no one dares to uncover. Who really controls this family? Them or their secrets? Every lavish detail hides a dangerous truth. And when it finally bursts into the light, Laurento Mansion could become a trap for everyone inside. What will happen when the mansion's biggest secret finally breaks the silence? If you found value in today's story, please consider subscribing. I would also love if you gave a comment sharing your thoughts on what we explored together. Thank you for watching. Now let us turn to a different kind of American monument. Twilight settles over the Philadelphia main line, that gilded corridor of old money and older secrets. The estate called Laurento rises from manicured grounds, its limestone facade catching the last amber light of day. Windows glow faintly from within. The mansion stands silent, patient, holding its stories close. Once the crown jewel of Philadelphia society, Laurento now whispers secrets money could not hide. This is the story of the Biddle family, their obsession with perfection, and the price they paid for it. The Biddles were not merely wealthy, they were architects of their own mythology, constructing a public image as carefully as they constructed their magnificent estate. Every dinner party was choreographed. Every business venture was calculated. Every marriage was strategic. The family understood that in Gilded Age Philadelphia, appearance was not just important. It was everything. But appearances, however carefully maintained, eventually crack. The year is 1923. A young heir, we shall call him Thomas, though his story represents multiple generations of Biddle descendants, discovers something unexpected in the mansion's library. The room itself is a cathedral to learning, with mahogany shelves rising 16 feet toward an ornate plaster ceiling. Late afternoon sun filters through leaded windows, casting geometric shadows across Persian rugs. Thomas has come looking for a specific legal document, something his father mentioned before his recent death. Instead, he finds a leather-bound journal wedged behind a row of volumes on architectural history. The journal is not labeled. The leather is worn, the pages brittle with age. Thomas opens it carefully. The handwriting is precise, controlled, unmistakably his grandfather's. The entries span decades from the 1880s through the turn of the century. Some passages describe business ventures, railway investments, partnerships with other Philadelphia dynasties. These Thomas expects. What he does not expect are the other entries, coded references to financial maneuvers that seem questionable at best, outright fraudulent at worst. References to a business partner who died suddenly, a sister-in-law who disappeared from all family records after 1891, a fire at a competitor's factory that proved remarkably convenient for Biddle interests. Thomas reads one passage 3 times, trying to reconcile the words with everything he knows about his family's history. The entry is dated November 1889. His grandfather writes with characteristic precision about a negotiation gone wrong, a threat that had to be managed permanently, and a payment made to ensure silence. The exact nature of the threat is not specified. The method of management is not detailed, but the implications are unmistakable. The journal slips from Thomas's hands. It falls to the floor with a sound too soft for the weight of what it carries. He has spent his entire life believing in the Biddle legacy, the family's reputation for integrity, their commitment to Philadelphia's cultural institutions, their role in building the city's infrastructure, funding its museums, supporting its universities. The Biddle name meant something. It stood for excellence, for civic responsibility, for the best traditions of American success. But standing in that library, surrounded by leather-bound certainties, Thomas understands that he has been living inside a carefully constructed fiction. The perfection was performance. The legacy was theater, and the cost of maintaining that performance was recorded in his grandfather's meticulous hand. Outside, the November light fades. Laurento's windows darken one by one. Thomas remains in the library, the journal open before him, reading entries that rewrite everything he thought he knew. He believes in that moment that uncovering these secrets might somehow restore authenticity to the family name. That honesty, however painful, might heal the wounds that money and status have only covered. He does not yet understand that some wounds cannot be healed. Some secrets, once revealed, change everything that comes after. This is where our story truly begins. The journal was not the only thing hidden in Laurento's walls. To understand what Thomas discovered, we must first understand the house itself. Laurento was not merely a residence. It was a declaration, built in 1884 when the Biddle fortune reached its zenith. The patriarch, Nicholas Biddle III, commissioned the Philadelphia architectural firm of Furness and Hewitt to create something unprecedented. The result was a 52-room palazzo that merged Italian Renaissance grandeur with American industrial confidence. The mansion rose on 37 acres of prime mainline property, its limestone façade quarried from the same Pennsylvania beds that supplied the Capitol building. The main entrance featured a double-height portico supported by Corinthian columns, each carved from single blocks of marble transported by rail from Vermont. Visitors approaching the house in carriages would see their reflections in floor-to-ceiling windows, would note the intricate ironwork balconies, would register the subtle message: the Biddles had arrived, and they intended to stay. Inside, the entrance hall stretched 40 feet to a grand staircase of Cuban mahogany. The ceiling was coffered and gilded, each panel hand-painted with allegorical scenes representing commerce, industry, culture, and family. Contemporary accounts describe guests stopping in their tracks, overwhelmed by the sheer opulence. This was precisely the intended effect. But Laurento's true genius lay in its hidden spaces. Nicholas Biddle III was a man who understood that power required privacy. The mansion contained not just the expected servants' corridors and back stairs, but a network of concealed passages known only to family members. A door in the library's bookcase led to a private study where sensitive business could be conducted away from even the most trusted staff. A panel in the main bedroom opened to a narrow stairway descending directly to the wine cellar, useful for midnight conferences that required absolute discretion. The third-floor ballroom, with its spectacular painted ceiling, had acoustic qualities that made it impossible to eavesdrop from adjacent rooms. The house was designed for secrets. Nicholas Biddle understood something fundamental about Gilded Age wealth. It was not enough to have money. One had to demonstrate mastery, control, dominance. Laurento accomplished this through sheer architectural intimidation. The morning room alone cost more than most Philadelphia families earned in a lifetime. The conservatory, with its imported palms and mechanized fountain system, required a full-time staff of 3 just to maintain. The family's art collection, hung throughout the public rooms, included works by European masters whose names carried weight in the cultural circles Nicholas sought to dominate. This arrangement was common among Philadelphia's industrial elite. The mansion was simultaneously home and fortress, showplace, and strategic asset. Every room served dual purposes. The dining room, which could seat 40 guests beneath crystal chandeliers, was where business alliances were forged over 9-course meals. The smoking room, paneled in rare zebra wood, was where political influence was traded like currency. Even the gardens, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted's firm, communicated control over nature itself. The construction took 4 years and employed hundreds of workers. Craftsmen were brought from Italy to install marble floors. Artisans from France created the ornamental plasterwork. The property's infrastructure required substantial engineering. Wells were dug, drainage systems installed, a private gas line extended from the city main. Roads had to be improved, the estate's entrance gate, An elaborate affair of wrought iron and bronze cost $8,000 alone. By the time the Biddle family moved into Laurento in the spring of 1888, the house had become legendary before they occupied it. Philadelphia society waited eagerly for the inaugural ball, the formal introduction of this monument to American ambition. What they witnessed that night was perfection. What they did not see was the darker machinery turning beneath Laurento's polished surfaces, the hidden study where Nicholas kept his true financial records, the locked drawer containing correspondence that could destroy rival families, the careful accounting of favors owed and debts collected. Thomas, standing in the library 8 decades later, was beginning to understand that his grandfather had built Laurento not just as a home, but as an instrument. Every room, every passage, every architectural flourish served the family's ruthless pursuit of status and power. The house knew everything. The house had always known. The house had always known. Thomas was only beginning to learn. The weeks following his discovery in the library transformed into an obsession. Thomas could not simply close the journal and return to his ordinary life. Each evening, after managing the family's remaining business interests, he returned to Laurento's hidden study, methodically working through his grandfather's papers. What emerged was a portrait of Philadelphia's Gilded Age that bore little resemblance to the sanitized version taught in schools or celebrated in society columns. The Biddle fortune, Thomas learned, was built on Pennsylvania coal and railroad speculation. Nicholas Biddle III had inherited substantial wealth from his father's banking connections, but he multiplied it through ventures that required, in his own words, flexible morality and iron discipline. The journal entries from the 1870s and 1880s described a systematic approach to eliminating competition. When rival coal operations threatened Biddle interests, Nicholas did not merely outbid them. He destroyed them through coordinated price manipulation, labor disruptions at strategic moments, and when necessary, more direct interventions. One entry from 1882 was particularly revealing. A competing mine owner named Samuel Crawford had discovered a rich vein that threatened to undercut Biddle pricing. Nicholas wrote matter-of-factly about arranging for Crawford's primary investor to withdraw funding suddenly, forcing Crawford into bankruptcy. The property was then acquired at auction for a fraction of its value. Crawford himself died 6 months later. The journal noted this development without emotion. The Crawford matter is resolved. Property transferred. No further complications anticipated. Thomas found himself wondering what no further complications actually meant. The family dynamics were equally ruthless. Nicholas had 3 siblings, 2 brothers, and a sister. The brothers were brought into the business and given positions of apparent authority. Apparently, the journal made clear that Nicholas controlled every significant decision, that his brothers' roles were largely theatrical. They attended board meetings, signed documents, appeared at social functions, but the real power never left Nicholas's hands. His sister Eleanor presented a different problem. Intelligent, ambitious, and unmarried by choice, Eleanor had opinions about family business that Nicholas found tiresome. She questioned certain investments. She expressed concern about labor conditions at Biddle-owned factories. She had, Nicholas wrote in 1889, inconvenient sympathies that threatened family unity and reputation. By 1891, Eleanor Biddle had vanished from all family records. No obituary appeared in Philadelphia newspapers. No grave marker bore her name in the family plot. Thomas searched through boxes of correspondence and found nothing after March 1891. It was as though she had simply ceased to exist. He found one letter, undated in Eleanor's handwriting. It was addressed to her mother, but apparently never sent, tucked into the journal's back pages. The letter was fragmentary, emotional, unlike the controlled prose of Nicholas's entries. Eleanor wrote about discovering something, about confronting her brother, about his response. The letter ended mid-sentence. He has promised me that if I speak of this to anyone, the consequences will. The rest was torn away. Thomas sat in the hidden study, Eleanor's unfinished letter trembling in his hands. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. Around him, Laurento's magnificent architecture took on a different character. The hidden passages were not just convenient, they were necessary. The soundproof rooms were not merely luxurious, they were strategic. The house had been designed to contain secrets, to muffle inconvenient truths, to ensure that the Biddle family's carefully constructed perfection remained undisturbed. He thought about the public face of his family. The Biddles were patrons of the arts, supporters of civic institutions, respected pillars of Philadelphia society. His grandfather had endowed a university library. The family name appeared on museum wings and concert hall plaques. 3 generations of Biddles had served on hospital boards, cultural committees, charitable organizations. But that was not the complete story. That was never the complete story. The Biddles had built their empire through calculated ruthlessness, had maintained it through strategic silence, and had passed it down through generations who inherited both the wealth and the carefully edited mythology. Thomas was the heir to both, the fortune and the lies, the mansion and the secrets it contained. Outside, November rain began to fall, streaking the study's small window. Thomas could hear water running through Laurento's elaborate drainage system, designed to channel rain away from the foundation, to keep the house dry and perfect and untouched by the elements. Some things, he was learning, could not be so easily channeled away. Some things could not be channeled away. Some debts accumulated across generations. Thomas's investigation led him beyond the journal into Laurento's deeper archives. The mansion's basement contained storage rooms that had not been opened in decades. Behind dust-covered furniture and stacked paintings, he found wooden crates marked with years: 1885, 1892, 1903. Inside were ledgers, correspondence, legal documents that told a story his family had worked deliberately to obscure. The financial records were particularly illuminating. Nicholas Biddle III had maintained 2 sets of books. The official ledgers, prepared for banks and business partners, showed steady profits from legitimate enterprises. The private records told a different story. Payments labeled consultation fees went to politicians. Legal services masked bribes to judges. Property maintenance covered payments to men whose services were decidedly not architectural. One ledger from 1893 listed monthly payments to a Philadelphia detective named William Graves. The amounts were substantial, ranging from $200 to $500. In an era when skilled workers earned perhaps $20 monthly, these payments represented serious money. The ledger entries were cryptic. Graves, monitoring. Graves, intervention required. Graves, matter concluded satisfactorily. Thomas cross-referenced these payments with newspaper archives he'd begun examining at the Philadelphia Public Library. In June 1893, a labor organizer named James Morrison had been organizing strikes at factories throughout the city, including 2 owned by Biddle interests. Morrison was reportedly planning a major action that would shut down operations for weeks. On June 23rd, Morrison disappeared. He was found 3 days later in the Schuylkill River. The death was ruled accidental drowning, though Morrison was known to be an excellent swimmer. The ledger showed a payment to William Graves on June 24th. Special services, $500, matter resolved. Thomas felt physically ill reading these connections. This was not abstract history. These were murders, covered up through wealth and influence, erased from the public record as though they had never occurred. His family's fortune, the money that built Laurento and funded generations of comfortable living, was stained with blood. But the financial corruption and violence were only part of the pattern. The family's obsession with perfection extended into every aspect of their lives, warping relationships, and destroying those who did not conform to the Biddle ideal. Nicholas's marriage to Catherine Newbold in 1879 had been celebrated as the union of two great Philadelphia families. Contemporary accounts described a lavish wedding, a honeymoon in Europe, a return to the newly completed Laurento. What the accounts did not mention was Catherine's struggle with what period documents euphemistically called nervous troubles. Thomas found letters from Catherine to her sister, smuggled out through sympathetic servants. The letters painted a picture of isolation and control. Nicholas monitored Catherine's correspondence, restricted her social activities, and consulted regularly with physicians about treatments for her supposed mental instability. When Catherine expressed unhappiness or questioned family decisions, Nicholas interpreted this as evidence of her condition requiring more aggressive intervention. By 1895, Catherine was essentially a prisoner in Laurento. She spent most days in her private chambers on the third floor, attended by nurses hired and supervised by Nicholas. When she appeared at social functions, she was heavily medicated, moving through events with the detached placidity that Philadelphia society interpreted as refined dignity. Catherine died in 1901 at age 43. The official cause was pneumonia. Nicholas remarried within the year. The pattern repeated across generations. Nicholas's sons learned their father's methods, applied them to their own families and business dealings. Inconvenient truths were buried. Troublesome individuals were managed. The Biddle reputation remained pristine, while the human cost accumulated in hidden ledgers and unspoken tragedies. Thomas understood now why his own father had been so distant, so rigidly controlled. The man had inherited not just wealth, but a poisonous legacy of secrets that required constant vigilance to maintain. Every interaction was calculated. Every relationship was strategic. Trust was impossible when your entire identity was constructed on lies. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. Thomas had believed he was uncovering the past. Instead, he was discovering that the past was not past at all. It lived in the mansion's architecture, in the family's continued insistence on appearances, in his own learned behaviors and assumptions. Laurento stood perfect and poisonous, a monument to ambition that had consumed everyone who lived within its walls. The question Thomas now faced was simple and terrible. What does one do with such knowledge? What does one do with such knowledge? Thomas was about to discover he might not have a choice. The discovery that forced his hand came not from the archives, but from the present. In early December 1923, Thomas received a visit from a lawyer named Robert Caldwell. The meeting was requested formally through written correspondence, which Thomas found unusual. The Biddles typically handled legal matters through the family's longtime firm. Caldwell represented interests Thomas did not recognize. They met in Laurento's formal receiving room, beneath the painted ceiling that depicted commerce as a noble goddess distributing wealth to grateful citizens. The irony was not lost on Thomas. Caldwell was direct. His clients were purchasing several properties along Philadelphia's waterfront, consolidating holdings for a planned development. One of these properties had, decades earlier, been owned by Samuel Crawford, the coal operator Nicholas Biddle had destroyed. Caldwell's firm, while researching property titles, had uncovered irregularities in how the Biddles acquired Crawford's assets after his bankruptcy. There were documents suggesting fraud, possibly worse. His clients were prepared to bring legal action unless the matter could be resolved privately. The word Caldwell used was accommodation. Thomas understood immediately. This was extortion, dressed in legal language. Caldwell's clients, whoever they were, had discovered some portion of Nicholas Biddle's activities and were leveraging this information for financial gain. The amount suggested was substantial, enough to significantly impact the family's already strained finances. Because the Biddle fortune, Thomas had recently discovered, was not what it appeared. His father's death 3 months earlier had revealed the uncomfortable truth. The family's wealth had been slowly eroding for decades. Poor investments during the 1907 panic, losses during the Great War, expensive maintenance of properties like Laurento that generated no income. The appearance of wealth had been maintained through increasingly creative accounting, but the reality was far more precarious. The Biddles were not broke, not yet, but they were no longer the financial titans they once had been. Thomas told Caldwell he needed time to consult with family advisors. Caldwell agreed to return in 1 week. After he left, Thomas sat in the receiving room for an hour, watching winter light fade across the ornate ceiling, understanding that everything was about to collapse. The blackmail attempt was merely the beginning. Within days, other problems emerged with startling rapidity. A Philadelphia newspaper columnist, known for muckraking exposés, began asking questions about Biddle family history. An anonymous source had apparently provided information about the 1893 labor disputes. The columnist was investigating connections between William Graves and several unsolved disappearances from that era. Simultaneously, a distant Biddle cousin, one of Eleanor's descendants, Thomas learned, contacted him through an intermediary. This branch of the family, cut off from the fortune decades earlier, was preparing to challenge Eleanor's removal from family records. They had hired genealogists and were building a case that Eleanor had been systematically erased to prevent her from claiming inheritance rights. The perfect façade was cracking from multiple directions at once. Thomas called an emergency meeting with his uncle Harrison and his cousin Margaret, the only family members he felt he could trust with the full truth. They gathered in the hidden study, surrounded by the evidence Thomas had compiled. He showed them the journals, the ledgers, the correspondence. He explained about Caldwell's blackmail attempt, the newspaper investigation, the cousin's legal challenge. Harrison, 62, and weathered by years of maintaining family secrets, said nothing for a long time. Finally, "Your grandfather anticipated this. There are protocols." "Protocols for what?" Thomas asked. "For protecting the family when the past becomes inconvenient." Margaret, younger and less entrenched in family tradition, cut through the euphemism. "You mean covering it up?" Again, making more problems disappear the way Nicholas made problems disappear. Harrison's silence was confirmation. Thomas felt something shift inside him. He had spent weeks confronting his family's history, wrestling with the gap between their public reputation and private reality. He had been searching for a way to reconcile these contradictions, to somehow preserve the family legacy while acknowledging its darker truths. But standing in that hidden study, listening to his uncle calmly suggest they deploy the same tactics that had poisoned 3 generations, Thomas understood that reconciliation was impossible. The family legacy was not something to be preserved. It was something to be survived. Outside, Philadelphia's winter evening settled over Laurento's grounds. Inside the mansion, 3 generations of Biddles confronted a question their ancestors had never allowed. What happens when perfect stops being possible? What happens when perfect stops being possible? For the Biddles, the answer came swiftly and without mercy. Thomas refused his uncle's protocols. He would not pay Caldwell's blackmail. He would not silence the newspaper columnist through the family's old channels of influence. He would not deploy lawyers to intimidate Eleanor's descendants into abandoning their legitimate questions. The decision horrified Harrison, who warned that Thomas was inviting disaster. Margaret supported him, though she understood the cost. The cost became apparent within days. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran its first story on December 18, 1923. The headline was restrained by the standards of the era. Questions raised about prominent families' business practices. The article was carefully worded, making no direct accusations, but it laid out a timeline that connected Biddle business interests with several suspicious deaths and disappearances between 1880 and 1900. The columnist, Benjamin Shaw, cited anonymous sources and suggested that further investigation was warranted. Philadelphia society responded with immediate distance. Invitations were quietly withdrawn. Business associates became suddenly unavailable for meetings. The Biddle name, which had opened doors for generations, now caused them to close. The speed of the social isolation was remarkable. Within a week, the family that had been central to Philadelphia's elite found itself functionally ostracized. The financial consequences followed predictably. Banks that had extended credit on the strength of the Biddle reputation now demanded immediate review of outstanding loans. Business partnerships dissolved. The family's seats on various corporate boards were politely requested to be vacated until these matters are clarified. Laurento itself became a liability. The mansion required a staff of 12 to maintain properly, an expense the family could no longer justify. Thomas began letting servants go, keeping only the essential housekeeping staff. The conservatory's exotic plants began dying from neglect. The grand rooms designed to showcase wealth and power stood increasingly empty. Thomas's uncle Harrison suffered what his doctors called a nervous collapse. The strain of watching everything he had work to protect unravel proved too much. He was admitted to a private sanitarium where he would remain for 6 months. His final words to Thomas before the ambulance came were bitter. "You have destroyed us for nothing. The truth will not set us free. It will only bury us." Perhaps he was right. Eleanor's descendants filed their legal challenge in January 1924. The case alleged that Eleanor Biddle had been systematically removed from family records, denied her inheritance, and possibly murdered to prevent her from exposing family secrets. The evidence was circumstantial, but substantial enough that a judge agreed to hear arguments. The proceedings would be public. Caldwell returned in February with modified terms. His clients no longer wanted just money. They wanted property. Specifically, they wanted Laurento. The mansion and its grounds would satisfy the family's debts related to the Crawford matter. Thomas had 30 days to decide. Margaret argued for acceptance. "It's just a house," she said, standing in the entrance hall where 4 generations of Biddles had greeted Philadelphia society. "Let it go. We can start over somewhere else. Build something honest." But Thomas understood it was not just a house. Laurento was the physical manifestation of everything the family had been. To surrender it was to admit complete defeat, to acknowledge that the entire Biddle legacy had been built on corruption and violence. The mansion contained not just memories but evidence, the hidden study, the concealed passages, the architecture of secrets that Nicholas had so carefully designed. What happened to that evidence if they lost the house? The breaking point came on a cold February evening. Thomas was alone in Laurento, Margaret having returned to her own residence. The remaining staff dismissed for the night. He walked through the empty rooms, remembering parties and gatherings, family dinners and holiday celebrations. Every memory was now tainted by knowledge. Every smile in his recollection concealed calculation. Every gesture of generosity masked self-interest. He ended in the library where he had first discovered his grandfather's journal. The room was dark except for moonlight through the tall windows. Outside, wind moved through bare tree branches, creating shadows that danced across the leather-bound volumes. Thomas made his decision. He would not fight the legal challenges. He would not accept Caldwell's terms. He would do something his family had never done. He would tell the complete truth. He would cooperate with Benjamin Shaw's investigation, provide access to the archives, let historians and journalists examine everything. The Biddle reputation would not survive. The family fortune would not survive. But perhaps something more valuable might emerge from the wreckage. Honesty, accountability, an end to secrets. The mansion seemed to shudder in the winter wind, as though anticipating what was to come. The mansion shuddered. The family shattered. Thomas's decision to cooperate with Benjamin Shaw's investigation detonated what remained of Biddle family unity. When word reached the extended family, cousins, aunts, distant relations who still carried the name, the response was swift and vicious. They accused Thomas of betrayal, of destroying a legacy out of misguided morality, of choosing strangers over blood. A family meeting was called for early March. 15 Biddles gathered in Laurento's dining room beneath the crystal chandeliers that had illuminated countless strategic dinners. Thomas sat at the head of the table, the position his grandfather had occupied, his father after him. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. His cousin Robert spoke first, voice tight with controlled anger. "You understand what you're doing. You're handing our enemies everything they need to destroy us. Grandfather built this family. Your father maintained it, and you're tearing it down because of some adolescent crisis of conscience." Thomas let him finish. Then he placed his grandfather's journal on the table, along with selected ledgers and correspondence. "This is what grandfather built. Read it. All of you. Then tell me what exactly I'm destroying." For 2 hours, the family reviewed the evidence. Some had suspected portions of the truth. None had seen it documented so thoroughly. The room grew quieter as they read, the initial anger giving way to something more complicated. Shock. Horror. And underneath it all, a kind of terrible recognition. They had all benefited from Nicholas Biddle's ruthlessness. The houses they lived in, the educations they received, the social positions they occupied. All of it was built on the foundation Thomas had uncovered. They were not innocent bystanders to history. They were its inheritors and its accomplices. Margaret broke the silence. "We have a choice. We can spend everything we have left trying to hide this, the way they did. Or we can face it, accept responsibility, and try to make whatever amends are possible." Amends? Robert's voice was hollow. How do you make amends for murder, for fraud that destroyed families, for a century of lies? "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but continuing to lie doesn't seem like the alternative." The vote, when it came, was split. 7 family members supported Thomas's approach. 8 wanted to fight, to deploy every legal and financial resource remaining to protect the family name. The Biddles, unified for generations by shared interest in maintaining their perfect façade, fractured along a new fault line. Truth versus preservation. Those who opposed Thomas's decision began their own campaign. They hired lawyers to block his access to family documents. They contacted newspaper editors, suggesting Benjamin Shaw's investigation was biased and irresponsible. They reached out to old family allies in Philadelphia's remaining elite circles, trying to rebuild the walls of protection that had insulated the Biddles for so long. But the walls were already crumbling. Shaw's second article appeared in mid-March, this one more detailed and damning. He had obtained additional sources beyond Thomas, including former servants who had witnessed disturbing incidents at Laurento, business associates who had been uncomfortable with Nicholas Biddle's methods, descendants of families the Biddles had destroyed. The article named names, cited specific instances, built an overwhelming case that the Biddle fortune was rooted in systematic criminality. The public reaction was immediate and intense. The Biddles became a symbol of Gilded Age excess and corruption, a cautionary tale about the moral rot beneath American aristocracy. Editorial writers used the family as an example of everything wrong with unchecked wealth and power. Reform politicians pointed to the Biddle case as justification for stronger regulations and greater oversight. Laurento itself became a target. Vandals broke windows. Paint was thrown at the limestone facade. The police provided periodic patrols. But their enthusiasm for protecting the disgraced family was notably limited. Financial pressures intensified. The family's remaining investments lost value as business partners distanced themselves. Properties were sold at losses to generate necessary cash. The maintenance staff at Laurento was reduced to 3 people, then 2, then finally just an elderly caretaker who had served the family for 40 years and had nowhere else to go. Thomas watched the empire collapse with a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief for what might have been, if his ancestors had chosen differently. Relief that the burden of maintaining lies was finally lifted. In April, Eleanor's descendants won their legal challenge. The judge ruled that Eleanor Biddle had been systematically erased from family records and was entitled to a portion of the estate. The financial settlement was substantial, requiring the sale of several properties. Laurento, however, remained in Thomas's possession. For now. Caldwell sent a final letter. His clients were willing to wait. They understood the family's financial situation. When Thomas was ready to sell, they would be ready to buy. The mansion stood quiet in the spring rain, its grandeur fading with each storm, each season, each revelation. The mansion stood quiet, but silence was not peace. By summer 1924, Thomas lived alone in Laurento. Margaret visited weekly, bringing food and attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but even she could not mask her concern. The house, designed for a staff of 12 and a family of prominence, had become a mausoleum for one man and his ghosts. Thomas spent his days cataloging the archives, preparing materials for historians who had requested access. The work was methodical, almost meditative. Each document he organized was another piece of the truth preserved, another secret brought into light. But the process took its toll. He lost weight. He slept poorly. The grand rooms of Laurento, once filled with calculated perfection, now echoed with emptiness. He discovered more as he worked. A locked trunk in the attic contained Eleanor's personal belongings, carefully packed and hidden away decades earlier. Her journals, her correspondence, her watercolor paintings of Laurento's gardens. Reading her words, Thomas encountered the aunt he had never known, intelligent, compassionate, increasingly horrified by what her family had become. One journal entry from March 1891 was particularly devastating. Eleanor had discovered the truth about the Crawford matter, had confronted Nicholas in the very study where Thomas now worked. Her account of that confrontation was precise and chilling. Nicholas had not denied the accusations. Instead, he had explained, calmly and methodically, why such actions were necessary. Family came first. Reputation was everything. Individuals who threatened these priorities had to be managed, just as one managed any business problem. Eleanor had threatened to go to the authorities. Nicholas had responded with characteristic clarity. If she spoke to anyone, she would be declared mentally unsound and committed to an asylum. The family physicians would support this diagnosis. Her mother would cooperate, as she always had. Eleanor would spend the rest of her life in an institution, her accusations dismissed as the delusions of a hysteric. The journal entries ended 2 weeks later. The final page contained only, "He has left me no choice. God forgive me for my weakness." Thomas sat in the attic for an hour after reading those words, Eleanor's journal open on his lap. His aunt had not been murdered, as her descendants suspected. She had been destroyed in a different way, silenced through the threat of institutional imprisonment, forced to choose between speaking truth and maintaining her freedom. She had chosen survival, then disappeared from all family records as though she had never existed. This, Thomas understood, was the Biddle method at its most refined. No violence necessary, no obvious crime, just the systematic application of wealth and power to erase inconvenient realities. He brought Eleanor's belongings to her descendants personally, driving to their modest home in West Philadelphia. They received the trunk with mixed emotions: gratitude for the artifacts, anger that they had been hidden, grief for the great-grandmother they were only now beginning to know. Thomas offered no excuses, only the truth as he had found it. The visit left him hollowed out. Driving back to Laurento, he understood fully what his Uncle Harrison had meant about truth not setting them free. The revelations had not brought healing or redemption. They had only exposed wounds that had never properly closed, pain that had been transmitted across generations like a genetic inheritance. Financial reality imposed its own verdict. By August, Thomas could no longer afford even minimal maintenance on Laurento. The property taxes alone consumed most of his remaining liquid assets. The roof was failing in several places. The grounds had grown wild, the carefully designed landscapes reverting to nature. The mansion that had symbolized Biddle power now represented only its collapse. Caldwell's clients made their final offer. They would purchase Laurento for considerably less than its assessed value, but enough to settle outstanding debts and provide Thomas with a modest living going forward. The offer was generous given the circumstances, perhaps even respectful. They understood they were buying history, not just property. Thomas accepted. The closing was scheduled for October. Margaret helped him pack what little he wanted to keep: family photographs, a few books, Eleanor's watercolors. Most of Laurento's contents would be sold at auction. The furniture, the art collection, the elaborate fixtures, all would be dispersed to collectors who appreciated craftsmanship without caring about the darkness it had contained. On his final night in the mansion, Thomas walked through every room. The grand staircase where Biddles had descended to greet Philadelphia society. The dining room where alliances had been forged and enemies neutralized. The library where he had discovered his grandfather's journal and begun this entire unraveling. The hidden study where generations of secrets had been conceived and executed. He ended in the entrance hall, beneath the painted ceiling with its allegorical figures: commerce, industry, culture, family, all rendered in gold leaf and classical grandeur. The figures looked down with serene confidence, embodying ideals the Biddles had proclaimed but never truly honored. Thomas turned off the lights one final time. Laurento settled into darkness, its secrets finally told, its perfect facade finally admitted as the fiction it had always been. Some stones, he had learned, were too heavy to carry. Some stones were too heavy to carry. Others refused to stay buried. Thomas moved to a modest apartment in Center City, Philadelphia, 3 rooms that could fit inside Laurento's entrance hall. The adjustment was profound. For the first time in his life, he was not surrounded by the weight of family history, not moving through spaces designed to intimidate and impress. The apartment was anonymous, unremarkable, and precisely what he needed. But distance from Laurento did not mean distance from its legacy. Benjamin Shaw's investigation had expanded beyond the Biddles. His reporting had sparked a broader examination of Gilded Age wealth throughout Philadelphia, revealing that the Biddle methods were not unique, but symptomatic of how American fortunes were built during that era. Other families faced similar scrutiny. Other secrets began emerging from archives and attics across the city. The public reaction was complex. Some saw the revelations as proof that the entire system was corrupt, that wealth itself was inherently immoral. Others argued that judging historical figures by modern standards was unfair, that the Biddles had simply played by the rules of their time. The debate raged in newspapers, in universities, in Philadelphia's social circles. Thomas found himself reluctantly positioned as a spokesperson for something he had never intended: a movement toward historical accountability. Journalists sought his comments. Reform organizations invited him to speak. Historians wanted interviews about the process of uncovering family secrets and the decision to make them public. He declined most requests. He had not exposed the truth to become a public figure or moral authority. He had done it because continuing to lie had become impossible, because the weight of knowing had been crushing him. But he agreed to a few carefully selected interviews, hoping that his family's story might help others grapple with their own difficult histories. One interview, published in Harper's Magazine in December 1924, captured his perspective. The journalist asked whether he regretted his decision to cooperate with Shaw's investigation. Thomas's response was measured. "Regret suggests I had a real choice, but once I knew the truth, continuing to protect lies would have destroyed me in different ways, perhaps more slowly, but just as completely. I chose the destruction I could survive." Meanwhile, Laurento entered a new chapter. Caldwell's clients were not the vulgar profiteers Thomas had initially assumed. They represented a coalition of Philadelphia institutions, museums, historical societies, preservation groups, who understood the mansion's architectural significance, even while grappling with its troubling history. They transformed Laurento into a museum and educational center dedicated to examining Gilded Age America with unflinching honesty. The mansion's hidden study was preserved exactly as Thomas had found it, complete with Nicholas Biddle's journals and ledgers. Visitors could see where the patriarch had planned his schemes, read his clinical descriptions of destroyed competitors, and silenced threats. The exhibit did not celebrate or condemn. It simply presented the evidence and invited reflection. Eleanor's story received particular attention. A wing of the mansion was dedicated to her life and forced silence, using her journals and artwork to tell the story of a woman who had seen clearly but been powerless to speak. Her descendants were involved in creating the exhibit, finally claiming their ancestors' place in family history. Thomas attended the museum's opening in May 1925. Walking through Laurento as a visitor rather than inhabitant was disorienting. The rooms he had grown up in were now public spaces, his family's secrets displayed behind glass for strangers to examine. It should have felt like violation. Instead, it felt like release. Margaret found him in the library, standing before the bookcase that concealed the hidden study. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm not sure," Thomas admitted. "This place destroyed our family." But preserving it like this, letting people see what wealth and secrecy can create, maybe that gives the destruction some meaning. Grandfather would have hated this. Yes, he would have. They stood quietly, surrounded by tourists examining the very mechanisms Nicholas Biddle had used to maintain his perfect façade. The irony was profound. The mansion he had designed to hide secrets was now dedicated to revealing them. The architecture of deception had become a monument to transparency. The financial settlement from the sale had not made Thomas wealthy, but it provided stability. He found work as a researcher for a Philadelphia historical society, helping other families navigate their archives, encouraging honesty about difficult discoveries. The work was meaningful, if modest. He would never again live in a mansion or move in elite social circles, but he was building something his ancestors never had, a life based on truth rather than performance. The Biddle name remained notorious, but notoriety was different than the false perfection his family had cultivated. People knew who the Biddles had been, both the achievements and the crimes. That knowledge was uncomfortable, but Thomas had learned that discomfort was preferable to the violence required to maintain comfort. One evening in late summer, he returned to Laurento as the museum was closing. The setting sun cast amber light through the tall windows, illuminating the entrance hall's painted ceiling. The allegorical figures still looked down with serene authority, but their meaning had shifted. They no longer represented Biddle superiority. They represented the gap between American ideals and American reality. Thomas stood beneath them, no longer crushed by their weight. Thomas stood beneath them, no longer crushed by their weight. But history, he was learning, never truly releases its grip. The years following Laurento's transformation brought unexpected developments. The museum became a destination for scholars studying Gilded Age America, but it also attracted descendants of the families Nicholas Biddle had destroyed. They came seeking documentation, proof of what their ancestors had endured, validation that their family stories of ruin and injustice were not exaggeration, but historical fact. Thomas met many of them. In 1926, a woman named Sarah Morrison visited the museum. She was the granddaughter of James Morrison, the labor organizer whose drowning in 1893 had been ruled accidental. Sarah had grown up hearing whispered stories about her grandfather's death, about Biddle involvement, about justice denied. The museum's archives provided confirmation. The ledger entry about William Graves's special services was circumstantial, but damning. She found Thomas in the museum's research room, surrounded by documents he was helping to catalog. "I wanted to thank you," she said, though her voice carried no warmth, "for finally admitting what your family did." "I'm sorry," seemed inadequate. Thomas said it anyway. Sorry doesn't bring him back. Sorry doesn't undo the poverty my grandmother faced, raising 3 children alone because your grandfather wanted to protect his profits. Sarah's anger was controlled, decades old, transmitted through generations. But at least now people know. At least the lie is finally dead. She was right. The lie was dead. But Thomas was beginning to understand that killing lies did not automatically birth justice. Truth was necessary, but not sufficient. It documented harm without repairing it. This realization prompted him to action. Working with Margaret and several of the Biddle family members who had supported his original decision, Thomas established a foundation in 1927. The Biddle Accountability Fund was designed to provide educational scholarships and financial assistance to descendants of families verifiably harmed by Nicholas Biddle's business practices. The fund was modest. The Biddle fortune had been substantially depleted, but it was something tangible, an acknowledgement that responsibility extended beyond confession. Not everyone approved. The Biddles who had opposed Thomas's transparency saw the foundation as compounding the betrayal, as institutionalizing the family's humiliation. Robert sent a blistering letter. You are not content with destroying our name. Now you want to subsidize our destroyers, to pay people to hate us. Grandfather would have disowned you. Thomas read the letter once and filed it away. His cousin was probably right. Nicholas would have disowned him. Thomas had come to see that as a distinction worth earning. The foundation's first recipient was the daughter of a factory worker who had been blacklisted after attempting to organize for better wages at a Biddle-owned plant in 1897. She used the scholarship to attend nursing school. The second recipient was a great-grandson of Samuel Crawford, the mine owner Nicholas had bankrupted. He studied labor law. These small acts of restitution did not erase the past. They did not balance the scales or provide closure, but they established a principle that families who benefited from historical injustice bore some responsibility for addressing its ongoing consequences. The work brought Thomas a measure of peace, though not the kind he had imagined. He would never be free of his family's history. The Biddle name would always carry its dark associations, but he was learning to live within that reality, to accept that redemption was not a destination, but a practice, imperfect and ongoing. In 1929, the stock market crashed. The financial devastation that followed affected Americans across all classes, but Thomas noticed something particular. The Gilded Age fortunes that had seemed so permanent, so unshakable, revealed their fragility. Families that had wielded power for generations suddenly faced ruin. The structures of wealth and influence that Nicholas Biddle had so carefully constructed were shown to be as vulnerable as anything else built by human hands. Laurento survived the Depression, sustained by its institutional ownership and educational mission. The mansion became, ironically, more relevant during hard times. Visitors came to understand how concentrated wealth had been built, how it had been protected, and what it had cost. The museum did not celebrate Gilded Age excess. It examined it with unflinching clarity. Thomas continued his work with the Historical Society, helping families navigate their archives, encouraging honest examination of difficult legacies. He married in 1931 a woman named Helen, who worked as a teacher and had no connection to Philadelphia's old families. They had 2 children, whom Thomas raised with deliberate honesty about their family history. His son and daughter knew about Nicholas Biddle, about Eleanor, about the crimes and cover-ups. They knew they were heirs to both achievements and atrocities. By the late 1930s, Thomas was no longer defined primarily by his decision to expose family secrets. He had built a life beyond that moment, had become someone in his own right, rather than simply a Biddle acting against type. But the decision remained foundational. It had shaped everything that followed. He returned to Laurento periodically, walking through rooms that no longer felt haunted by perfection's demands. The mansion had become what it perhaps always should have been. Not a monument to family greatness, but a teacher about the human capacity for both creation and destruction. The stones were still heavy, but they no longer crushed him. The stones no longer crushed him, but they would be carried forward nonetheless. By 1945, Thomas was 63 years old. The war had ended, and Philadelphia, like the rest of America, was transforming. The old social hierarchies that had defined the city for generations were loosening, though not disappearing. The Biddle name still carried weight, but the nature of that weight had fundamentally changed. His children, Eleanor, named for her great-great-aunt, and Nicholas, had grown into thoughtful adults. Thomas had wondered, during their childhoods, whether naming his son after the patriarch would be a burden or a provocation. Nicholas Jr. had answered that question himself at age 16 when asked by a teacher about his famous ancestor. "My great-great-grandfather built a fortune through ruthlessness and crime," Nicholas had said plainly. "My father exposed that truth when he could have hidden it. I'm named after the first, but trying to learn from the second." The response had made Thomas proud in ways he could not fully articulate. Eleanor, at 22, had become a social worker, deliberately choosing work that served populations her ancestors would have exploited or ignored. She spent her days in Philadelphia's poorest neighborhoods, helping families navigate systems designed to exclude them. The Biddle Accountability Fund had expanded under her involvement, growing beyond educational scholarships to include housing assistance and legal aid. One evening in 1946, Eleanor brought home a case that connected directly to family history. An elderly black woman named Ruth Washington had approached the fund seeking help with a property dispute. Her grandmother had worked as a servant at Laurento in the 1890s. According to family oral history, she had been promised a small house on Biddle-owned land in exchange for her service, but the promise had never been fulfilled. Ruth had documentation, letters, a verbal contract witnessed by other servants, but no legal standing to claim what should have been her inheritance. Thomas reviewed the materials with a historian's eye. The letters were genuine, written in Nicholas Biddle's distinctive hand. The promise had been real. The failure to honor it had been deliberate, part of a pattern Thomas recognized from his grandfather's journals. Nicholas had frequently made promises to servants and workers, then found legal technicalities to avoid fulfillment. Eleanor wanted the fund to purchase a home for Ruth Washington. "She's 78 years old. She's lived her entire life in poverty, while our family benefited from her grandmother's labor. We have the resources to make this right." Margaret, now 70 and still involved with the foundation, supported the action. But other board members hesitated. Setting a precedent for property-based restitution could open the foundation to thousands of claims. The resources were finite. Where would they draw the line? The debate consumed weeks. Thomas found himself mediating between practical concerns and moral imperatives, between what was feasible and what was right. Finally, he proposed a compromise. The fund would purchase a home for Ruth Washington, explicitly framing it not as restitution, but as an acknowledgement of debt. They would set strict criteria for similar future cases requiring substantial documentation and direct connection to documented Biddle promises. Ruth Washington received her house in spring 1947. She lived there for 11 more years, hosting her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren in a space that was finally, irrevocably theirs. At the dedication ceremony, she thanked the Biddle family with grace that Thomas felt he did not deserve. "Your grandfather made a promise and broke it," she told him. "You made a promise and kept it. That's all any of us can do. Try to be better than what came before." The incident reinforced something Thomas had been learning slowly over decades. Addressing historical injustice was not a single dramatic act, but an ongoing practice requiring constant negotiation between ideal and possible. There would never be a moment when the family's debt was fully paid, when they could declare the accounts settled and move forward unburdened. The work would continue across generations. This understanding shaped how Thomas approached his final years. He donated his personal papers to the Historical Society, creating an archive that documented not just his grandfather's crimes, but his own process of discovery and response. He wanted future researchers to see the full complexity, the temptations to hide truth, the costs of revealing it, the imperfect attempts at repair. He also worked with Laurento's museum directors to expand their programming. The museum began hosting dialogues between descendants of Gilded Age elite families and descendants of those they had exploited. The conversations were often difficult, sometimes hostile, but always necessary. They moved beyond simple narratives of villains and victims toward more complex understanding of how historical harm perpetuated across time. Thomas's health began declining in 1950. Heart problems, the doctors said, likely exacerbated by years of stress. He spent more time at home, surrounded by the modest life he had built. Helen read to him in the evenings. His children visited regularly, bringing grandchildren who knew the family stories, but were not defined by them. One afternoon, Nicholas Jr. asked him directly, "Do you regret it? Everything that happened after you found the journal?" Thomas considered the question carefully. He thought about Laurento lost, the family fractured, the comfortable life that could have been his if he had simply closed the journal and returned it to its hiding place. "I regret that my grandfather made choices that required mine," he finally said. "I regret that truth was so destructive. But no, I don't regret telling it. Some inheritances have to be refused." His son nodded, understanding the distinction. The Biddle legacy would continue, but its meaning had fundamentally changed. No longer a story of wealth and power maintained across generations, it had become something more complicated and more human. A story about confronting difficult truths and attempting, imperfectly, to live with their consequences. Some inheritances have to be refused. Others insist on being remembered. Thomas died in December 1952, quietly in his sleep. The obituaries were respectful, but honest, describing him as the Biddle who chose truth over legacy. The funeral was small. Family, close friends, representatives from the organizations he had worked with. No elaborate ceremony in a grand church. No procession past Philadelphia's monuments. He had requested simplicity, and his family honored that request. But his death prompted something unexpected. Letters began arriving at the Biddle Accountability Fund from across the country. Descendants of other Gilded Age families, inspired by Thomas's example, were beginning their own reckonings with difficult histories. They sought advice, shared discoveries, asked how to navigate the space between honoring ancestors and acknowledging their harm. Eleanor took on the responsibility of responding. She understood that her father's decision had created a kind of template, imperfect but useful for others facing similar dilemmas. The correspondence became a network, then a movement. By 1955, similar accountability funds and museums were being established by other families, Morgans, Carnegies, Vanderbilts, each grappling with how their wealth had been built and what responsibility they bore for its methods. Laurento remained central to this broader conversation. The museum expanded its mission, hosting conferences on historical accountability, developing educational materials for schools, creating research fellowships for scholars studying Gilded Age America. The mansion that Nicholas Biddle had designed as a fortress of secrets became a center for their examination. In 1960, Eleanor worked with museum directors to add a new, permanent exhibit. It focused specifically on the process of historical reckoning, not just what the Biddles had done, but how Thomas had chosen to respond, the consequences that followed, and the ongoing work of repair. The exhibit included Thomas's personal papers, his correspondence with descendants of families the Biddles had harmed, documentation of the Foundation's work. One section displayed Eleanor Biddle's watercolors alongside her journals. Visitors could see the beauty she had created, delicate paintings of Laurento's gardens, while reading her words about the ugliness she had witnessed. The juxtaposition was deliberate. It demonstrated how complexity existed within individuals, how people could be both victims and complicit, how clarity was often harder than condemnation. Another section focused on Ruth Washington and other beneficiaries of the Accountability Fund. Their stories were told in their own words, through oral histories recorded by museum staff. These narratives complicated the simple story of Biddle redemption. Many expressed gratitude for the assistance while also noting its inadequacy. Housing or scholarships did not undo generations of harm, but they acknowledged that doing something was better than doing nothing. The exhibit's final room contained a question painted on the wall. What do we owe the past? And what does the past owe us? Visitors were invited to write responses on cards that would be displayed in rotating exhibitions. The answers varied wildly. Some argued that the past owed nothing, that only present actions mattered. Others insisted that historical debts could never be fully paid. Still others suggested that the question itself was flawed, that focusing on what was owed perpetuated transactional thinking about justice and repair. Eleanor read these responses regularly, finding in them both frustration and hope. The frustration came from recognizing how resistant these questions were to easy answers. The hope came from seeing people genuinely grapple with complexity rather than retreating into simplistic narratives. By 1965, Eleanor was 41, the same age her father had been when he discovered Nicholas Biddle's journal. The parallel was not lost on her. She had built her entire adult life around the consequences of his discovery, had inherited not wealth, but responsibility. She wondered sometimes what her life might have been if Thomas had made a different choice, if the Biddle fortune had remained intact and the secrets buried. She could not imagine it. The person she had become was inseparable from the truth her father had told. Her own children, the fifth generation since Nicholas Biddle built Laurento, knew the family history as foundational narrative. They understood themselves as inheritors of both harm and accountability. One grandson studied restorative justice, specifically examining how historical wrongs might be addressed when direct restitution was impossible. Another became an architect, fascinated by how buildings could embody both beauty and violence, how spaces could be redesigned to acknowledge their complicated histories. Laurento itself continued to age. The limestone façade weathered. The ornate interiors required constant maintenance, but the mansion endured, no longer perfect, but honest, no longer hiding secrets, but displaying them, no longer crushing those who lived within its walls, but teaching those who visited. On December evenings, when the museum closed and the last visitors departed, the building settled into darkness, much as it had on Thomas's final night as owner. But the darkness felt different now, not oppressive, but contemplative, not concealing, but resting. The mansion had become what perhaps all monuments should be, not a celebration of greatness, but a witness to human complexity. The Biddles had built it to project power. Time and truth had transformed it into something more valuable, a place where Americans could confront the contradictions in their history and themselves. Some inheritances have to be refused. Others, examined honestly, become bearable. The stones remained heavy, but generations were learning to share the weight. The stones remained heavy, but generations were learning to share the weight. Some, however, refused to lift them at all. In 1978, a man named Robert Biddle III arrived at Laurento unannounced. He was the grandson of Thomas's cousin Robert, the one who had accused Thomas of destroying the family legacy. Robert III was 45, a corporate lawyer in New York, and he had spent his entire life resenting what Thomas had done. Eleanor, now serving as the Accountability Fund's executive director, met with him in what had once been Nicholas Biddle's formal receiving room. The space was now a museum gallery, displaying artifacts from the family's business empire. Stock certificates, contracts, correspondence, documenting both legitimate ventures and criminal schemes. My grandfather died angry. Robert III began without preamble. He spent his final years watching everything our family built get torn down, turned into a monument to our supposed sins. Your father did that. Eleanor had heard variations of this argument before, from family members who never reconciled with Thomas's decision. She listened patiently. My grandfather wasn't a criminal, Robert III continued. He was a product of his time. Judging him by modern standards is unfair and dishonest. Your father's self-righteous crusade destroyed lives, scattered the family, cost us everything. And for what? So strangers could feel morally superior while picking through our history. Is that why you came? Eleanor asked quietly. To tell me my father was wrong? I came because I want this to end. Robert III gestured at the museum around them. This performance of guilt, this endless flagellation. It's been 50 years. At some point, we have to move on. Eleanor considered her response carefully. She understood his anger, even sympathized with it in some ways. Carrying historical shame was exhausting. The work of repair was never finished. The Biddle name would probably never recover its former prestige. These were real costs. Moving on suggests we've arrived somewhere, she finally said. But the people harmed by what Nicholas Biddle did, their descendants are still living with consequences. Poverty that compounds across generations. Trauma that doesn't disappear just because time passes. What you call moving on, they might call forgetting. So, we're supposed to apologize forever, pay penance eternally, never be allowed to just be people instead of symbols? No, Eleanor said. We're supposed to tell the truth and do what we can to address harm. That's not punishment. It's responsibility. Robert III stood abruptly. I have children. I don't want them growing up ashamed of their name, defined by what some ancestor did a century ago. They deserve better. They do, Eleanor agreed. That's why the truth matters. If we taught them that Nicholas Biddle was simply misunderstood, or that his methods were acceptable for his era, we'd be teaching them that power justifies harm. That's the inheritance that needs to be refused. The conversation ended without resolution. Robert III left Laurento angry, unconvinced, still carrying the resentment his grandfather had passed down. Eleanor watched him go, understanding that some family members would never accept what Thomas had done, would always see it as betrayal rather than courage. But the encounter prompted reflection. Was there a point where historical accountability became its own form of injustice? When did responsibility for ancestral actions become unfair burden on descendants who had no control over those actions? Eleanor discussed this with the museum's board that evening. The question was philosophical, but also practical. The Biddle Accountability Fund had been operating for 50 years. How much longer should it continue? When, if ever, could the family's debt be considered satisfied? The board members, representing diverse perspectives, including several descendants of families the Biddles had harmed, offered no consensus. Some argued that systemic harm required systemic response that necessarily extended across generations. Others suggested that individual descendants, like Robert III's children, should not be held personally responsible for ancestral crimes, even while acknowledging that they had benefited from them. One board member, a historian specializing in restorative justice, offered a distinction that resonated with Eleanor. The question isn't whether descendants are responsible for what their ancestors did. The question is whether they're responsible for what they do with that inheritance. Every generation has to choose what to preserve and what to refuse, what to acknowledge and what to address. This framing shifted Eleanor's thinking. The work wasn't about perpetual guilt or endless apology. It was about making conscious choices about what values to carry forward. Robert III wanted to move on without doing that work, wanted to inherit the benefits of Biddle wealth without grappling with its costs. That was the inheritance Thomas had refused. Later that night, Eleanor walked through Laurento after the museum closed. She had spent countless hours here over the decades, but the building still revealed new dimensions. In the entrance hall, she noticed something she had never consciously registered before. The allegorical figure representing family, painted on the coffered ceiling, was looking down with an expression that could be read as either serene confidence or profound sadness. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it had always been both. The Biddle family would continue fragmenting into branches with different relationships to their history. Some, like Robert III, would resist accountability. Others would embrace it. Still others would navigate complicated middle ground, acknowledging harm while struggling with how to address it. There would be no moment of completion, no final resolution. Historical accountability was not a debt that could be paid off and closed. It was an ongoing practice, renewed or refused by each generation. Eleanor understood now what her father had understood in 1923, that telling the truth would not heal everything, would not make everyone whole, would not restore what had been lost, but it would make something else possible. The chance to build differently, to inherit consciously rather than blindly, to choose values rather than simply accept them. The mansion stood in darkness, holding its stories, not perfectly, but honestly. That, Eleanor had learned, was the only perfection worth pursuing. That was the only perfection worth pursuing. But even honesty had its archaeology, layers of meaning that shifted with time. By 1995, Laurento had become something its builder could never have imagined. A pilgrimage site for those wrestling with America's uncomfortable truths. The museum attracted not just historians and students, but families from across the country, each carrying their own complicated legacies, descendants of enslaved people, families whose ancestors had built railroads under brutal conditions, communities displaced by industrial expansion. They came to see how one family had confronted its past, searching for templates for their own reckonings. The mansion itself was showing its age in ways that money could not entirely address. The limestone façade, exposed to Philadelphia's industrial pollution and weather for over a century, was deteriorating despite regular maintenance. The interior plasterwork had cracked in places. The hidden study where Nicholas Biddle had plotted his schemes now required climate control to preserve the documents it contained. The museum's director, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, proposed a controversial renovation. Rather than restoring Laurento to its 1888 perfection, she suggested preserving the decay as part of the story. Let visitors see the cracks in the gilded ceiling, the water stains on ornate wallpaper, the way time and truth had worn down the facade of invulnerability. "We've been telling the story of what the Biddles did," Dr. Chen explained to the board. "But the building itself tells a different story. About impermanence? About how even the most powerful structures eventually reveal their fragility. That's a story worth preserving, too." Eleanor, now 71 and advisory rather than executive, supported the approach. Her children were less certain. They worried that allowing decay could be interpreted as disrespect, or worse, as abandonment of the work Thomas had begun. The debate reflected a broader question. How should historical sites embody the histories they represent? Should they present sanitized perfection? Or should they show the erosion and damage that time and truth inevitably create? The board voted to implement Dr. Chen's vision, with careful documentation of what was being preserved in its damaged state versus what required stabilization for structural safety. The result was a building that looked both magnificent and wounded, that communicated both the grandeur of Gilded Age ambition and the costs of sustaining it. The renovation attracted significant media attention. The New York Times ran a feature titled, "The Mansion That Refuses to Forget." The article examined how Laurento had become a model for other historical sites, grappling with difficult legacies. Colonial plantations were beginning to tell more complete stories about slavery. Industrial museums were acknowledging labor exploitation. Presidential libraries were confronting their subjects' failures alongside their achievements. But the attention also brought criticism. Conservative commentators accused the museum of weaponizing guilt, of turning American history into an endless indictment. They argued that focusing on historical wrongs undermined national unity and patriotic pride. Some descendants of Gilded Age families saw Laurento as a cautionary tale of what happened when you apologized for success. Eleanor found herself once again defending her father's legacy, now in television interviews and op-eds rather than family meetings. The arguments had evolved, but the core question remained: what did Americans owe their history, and what did history owe them? One interview conducted in Laurento's library, where Thomas had found the journal, captured the complexity of her position. The journalist asked whether Thomas's decision had ultimately helped or harmed the Biddle family. Eleanor paused before answering, aware that the bookcase concealing the hidden study stood just behind her. That depends on what you think a family is for. If it's about accumulating and protecting wealth, about maintaining status across generations, then my father destroyed ours. But if it's about becoming people we can respect, about living with integrity rather than just inherited privilege, then he saved us, or at least gave us the chance to save ourselves. Do you think your great-great-grandfather was evil? The journalist pressed. I think he was human, Eleanor responded carefully, which meant he was capable of both remarkable creation and terrible harm. The evil was in the system that rewarded the harm and celebrated the creation while hiding the connection between them. My father's contribution was refusing to keep hiding that connection. The interview aired during a period of renewed national conversation about historical memory. Confederate monuments were being removed from public spaces. Universities were examining their founders' involvement in slavery. Corporations were researching their historical ties to injustice. The work Thomas had begun with one family's archives had helped catalyze something larger, a cultural shift toward confronting rather than concealing difficult truths. But Eleanor, watching these developments from her modest home in West Philadelphia, understood that cultural shifts were fragile. Each generation had to choose whether to continue the work or abandon it. Her grandchildren, the sixth generation since Nicholas Biddle, were growing up in a world where historical accountability was contested terrain rather than settled principle. She took them to Laurento regularly, walking them through the rooms where their ancestors had lived and schemed and ultimately been exposed. She showed them Eleanor's watercolors and journals. She explained Thomas's decision and its consequences. She wanted them to understand that they would face their own versions of that choice. Perhaps not as dramatically, but inevitably. Every inheritance came with the question of what to preserve and what to refuse. One grandson, 15 years old, asked her the question that had haunted generations. Will people always hate our name? Will we always be the family that did terrible things? Eleanor considered the question, aware that her answer would shape how he understood himself. People will remember what we did, she finally said. Both the terrible things and the response to them. That's not hate. That's history. What matters is what you do with that history, whether you run from it or learn from it. The boy nodded slowly, not entirely satisfied, but beginning to understand. Laurento stood behind them, magnificent and broken, honest in its imperfection, a monument to the truth that some stones must be carried because refusing their weight means forgetting what they represent. Some stones must be carried. Others cast shadows that outlast the carriers themselves. Eleanor Biddle died in 2003 at age 79. Her obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer described her as the architect of accountability, a phrase she would have found simultaneously accurate and uncomfortable. She had spent her adult life building frameworks for addressing historical harm, but she had never claimed to have solved the underlying problems. The work, she had always insisted, was never finished. Her funeral was held not in a church, but at Laurento itself, in the third-floor ballroom where Nicholas Biddle had once entertained Philadelphia society. The room's acoustic qualities, designed to prevent eavesdropping, now amplified eulogies that celebrated Eleanor's commitment to transparency. The symbolism was deliberate, arranged by her children who understood that even grief could serve as education. Among the mourners were descendants of families the Biddles had harmed, some connected through the Accountability Fund's work, others simply present to honor a woman who had acknowledged their ancestors' suffering. Their presence transformed the funeral into something more complex than simple mourning. It became a gathering of people connected by historical violence and imperfect repair, by harm acknowledged, but never fully healed. Ruth Washington's great-granddaughter spoke during the service. She was a lawyer now, educated partly through fund scholarships. "My family could have carried bitterness," she said. "We could have defined ourselves by what was taken from us. Eleanor Biddle gave us something different, not compensation because that's impossible, but recognition." She looked at our history and said, "This happened. It mattered. You matter." That recognition changed what we inherited. The words captured something essential about Eleanor's work. She had not erased harm or balanced historical accounts. She had simply refused to let harm remain invisible, refused to let the Biddle family's comfort depend on others' erasure. After her death, the Accountability Fund faced questions about its future. Eleanor had been its driving force for 4 decades. Her children were committed to continuing the work, but they lacked her moral authority, the weight of being Thomas's daughter, the living connection to the moment when the Biddle family chose truth over protection. The fund's board debated whether to expand or conclude operations. They had distributed millions in scholarships and housing assistance. They had funded research into Gilded Age labor practices. They had supported restorative justice initiatives across the country. Was there a point where the family's active responsibility could be considered fulfilled, where the work could transition from Biddle obligation to broader institutional commitment? The decision came in 2005. The Accountability Fund would continue operating, but governance would shift away from Biddle family control. A new board, majority composed of community members and descendants of affected families, would direct future operations. The Biddles would maintain funding commitments, but not decision-making authority. The transition was profound. For 80 years, the fund had been a Biddle family project, their attempt to address their ancestors' harm. Now it would become something larger, a community-driven institution that happened to be funded by Biddle money. The distinction mattered. Some family members saw this as the final dissolution of their legacy. Robert Biddle III, now elderly himself, sent a bitter letter to the Philadelphia Inquirer. "My great-uncle Thomas began dismantling this family in 1923. His daughter finished the work. The Biddle name, once synonymous with Philadelphia excellence, now represents only apology and capitulation. Future generations will ask what we stood for, and the answer will be nothing, only what we stood against." But others saw the transition differently. Eleanor's grandson, the one who had asked whether people would always hate their name, was now 30 and teaching history at Temple University. He wrote a response. "What we stand for is accountability. What we stand for is choosing truth over comfort. My great-great-grandfather built a fortune through harm. My great-grandfather exposed that truth. My grandmother spent her life addressing its consequences. That's not nothing. That's a legacy of moral courage that matters more than wealth or status ever could." The exchange captured the ongoing split within the Biddle family between those who mourned the loss of their former position and those who celebrated their evolution into something more honest, if less prestigious. Laurento itself entered a new chapter. The museum's attendance had grown substantially, driven partly by renewed national interest in Gilded Age history, but also by the building's unique approach to presenting that history. Unlike other mansions that celebrated robber baron achievement, Laurento insisted on examining costs alongside accomplishments, violence alongside vision. Dr. Chen developed a new permanent exhibit titled The Architecture of Accountability. It traced how the mansion itself had been transformed, from Nicholas Biddle's Fortress of Secrets to Thomas's Moment of Revelation, to Eleanor's space of education and repair. The exhibit used the building's physical evolution, including its preserved decay, to tell a story about how structures and families could choose to change. The final room of the exhibit contained a question different from the one posed in 1960. Instead of what do we owe the past, and what does the past owe us? The new question read, what stories will your grandchildren tell about how you lived with history? Visitors were invited to record video responses, creating an archive of contemporary Americans wrestling with their own complicated inheritances. The responses revealed the diversity of American historical consciousness. Some people embraced accountability work, others resented it. Many occupied ambivalent middle ground. Thomas's great-great-grandchildren visited Laurento regularly, bringing their own children to see where the family's transformation had begun. They were seventh-generation Biddles, far removed from Nicholas's schemes and even from Thomas's courageous exposure. But they carried the legacy nonetheless, not as burden, but as inheritance consciously examined and selectively preserved. The mansion stood through Philadelphia's seasons, its cracked facade and preserved imperfections telling truth more effectively than restoration ever could. Nicholas Biddle had built it to project eternal power. Time and honesty had transformed it into something more valuable, a witness to the possibility that families, like nations, could choose to remember rather than forget, to acknowledge rather than conceal. The shadows were long, but they no longer hid what they once protected. The shadows no longer hid what they once protected, but in 2018, they revealed something unexpected. During routine structural assessment, engineers discovered a sealed chamber behind a false wall in Laurento's basement. The space had been expertly concealed, built into the mansion's original 1884 construction. Museum staff carefully opened the chamber, unsure what they might find. Inside were wooden filing cabinets containing documents Nicholas Biddle had apparently considered too sensitive even for his hidden study. Financial records detailing systematic bribery of state legislators, correspondence with private detectives documenting surveillance of business rivals and labor organizers, contracts with individuals whose services were described only through coded language, and most disturbing, a personal diary, separate from the journal Thomas had found, in which Nicholas reflected on his methods with chilling philosophical detachment. One entry from 1890 was particularly revealing. Power requires clarity about human nature. Men respond to incentives, reward and punishment, opportunity and threat. Morality is performance for those without power, justification for those who possess it. I have built an empire by understanding this. My descendants will inherit wealth. Whether they inherit wisdom depends on whether they understand that comfort requires someone else's discomfort, that order requires enforcement, that civilization is maintained through means the civilized prefer not to examine. Dr. Chen called an emergency board meeting. The discovery raised profound questions. Should these materials be added to the museum's exhibits? Did they change the story Laurento had been telling for decades? Would displaying Nicholas Biddle's philosophical justifications for his actions be educational or merely give platform to ideas that should remain buried? The board debated intensely. Some members argued that the materials demonstrated the banality of evil, showing how intelligent people rationalized harm through abstract philosophy. Others worried that presenting Nicholas's worldview so directly might legitimize it, might suggest that his perspective deserved consideration alongside condemnation. Thomas's great-great-granddaughter, serving on the board at 32, made the case for inclusion. My ancestors' philosophy is still alive. It's visible in how wealth justifies itself today, in how power dismisses accountability as weakness. Hiding his words doesn't make his ideas disappear. It just lets them operate without challenge. The board voted to create a new exhibit around the discovery, but with extensive contextual framing. Nicholas Biddle's philosophical justifications would be displayed alongside the documented consequences of those justifications. The families destroyed, the workers killed, the systems of exploitation his philosophy enabled. Visitors would encounter both his worldview and its human cost. The exhibit opened in 2019 titled The Philosophy of Harm. How Power Justifies Itself. It attracted immediate controversy. Some praised the museum for unflinching honesty. Others accused it of false equivalence, of treating Nicholas Biddle's ideas as worthy of serious engagement rather than simple condemnation. A viral social media post criticized the exhibit harshly. Why are we platforming a 19th century sociopath's justifications for murder? This is exactly how privilege perpetuates itself, by insisting we understand perspectives that don't deserve understanding. The museum responded with a statement explaining their reasoning. Understanding is not endorsement. Nicholas Biddle's philosophy matters not because it was correct, but because it was consequential. These ideas shaped how American wealth was built and justified. They echo in contemporary debates about inequality, labor, and power. Confronting them directly, rather than simply condemning them from distance, helps us recognize when similar logic appears in modern forms. The controversy drew unprecedented attendance. People came to judge for themselves whether the exhibit was educational or offensive. Many arrived angry, ready to protest, and left thoughtful, recognizing elements of Nicholas's philosophy in contemporary political and economic discourse. One visitor, a college student studying economics, recorded a video response that captured something essential. Reading his actual words made me realize this isn't just history. It's the origin story for ideas I hear every day. That poverty is personal failure, that wealth proves merit, that questioning the system shows weakness. He believed these things explicitly. We believe them implicitly. The difference is, we pretend they're natural laws instead of choices. The discovery and its aftermath demonstrated that Laurento's work remained unfinished, that each generation uncovered new layers of historical complexity. The mansion was not a static memorial, but an active archaeological site, constantly revealing how the past shaped the present. But the controversy also revealed resistance. A well-funded campaign emerged, led by descendants of other Gilded Age families, arguing that museums like Laurento promoted historical guilt that undermined American confidence. They characterized the accountability movement as political rather than educational, as attack rather than examination. Robert Biddle III, now 92, gave a final interview before his death that year. "I told you this would never end," he said. Thomas opened a door in 1923 that should have stayed closed. Now every generation has to perform their righteousness by condemning ancestors they never knew, by claiming moral superiority to people who built the very civilization that allows such luxury as moral superiority. It's exhausting and pointless. He died weeks later, still bitter, still convinced that his great-uncle had betrayed the family rather than saved it. His obituary noted that he had excluded himself from the Biddle family plot, choosing instead to be buried in his wife's family cemetery. Even in death, he refused reconciliation with the path Thomas had chosen. The division would persist. Some Biddles would always see Thomas's revelation as destruction. Others would see it as liberation. The family, like the nation it reflected, remained split between those who wanted to forget uncomfortable truths and those who insisted on remembering them. Laurento stood between these positions, neither condemning nor celebrating, simply bearing witness. The mansion's cracked façade and preserved imperfections communicated a message Nicholas Biddle never intended, but which had become its most important teaching: that honesty about harm matters more than the appearance of perfection, that buildings and families endure not by hiding their flaws, but by acknowledging them. The stones remained heavy, but each generation learned to carry them differently, understanding that the weight was not punishment, but responsibility. the cost of inheriting history rather than being crushed by it. The stones remained heavy. By 2023, they had become nearly unbearable. The COVID-19 pandemic devastated Laurento's operations. The museum closed for 18 months, losing critical revenue from admissions, events, and educational programming. When it finally reopened in late 2021, attendance remained depressed. School groups, once a cornerstone of the museum's mission, had largely disappeared. The endowment, carefully built over decades, had been depleted to maintain the building and retain skeleton staff. By spring 2023, the board faced an impossible decision. Laurento required over $2 million in urgent structural repairs. The foundation was shifting, threatening the entire building's stability. The museum's operating budget could not accommodate this expense. The Accountability Fund, now independently governed, had its own commitments and could not divert resources to building maintenance. The Biddle family, generations removed from substantial wealth, could not provide the needed capital. Dr. Chen presented 3 options to the board. First, sell Laurento to private developers who would likely convert it into luxury condominiums, ending its educational mission. Second, transfer ownership to the city or state, hoping government funding might sustain it, though budget constraints made this uncertain. Third, launch an ambitious fundraising campaign with no guarantee of success, risking the building's deterioration while seeking resources that might never materialize. The meeting took place in the mansion's library, the room where Thomas had found his grandfather's journal exactly 1 century earlier. The parallel was haunting. Thomas had discovered truth that required difficult choices. Now his descendants faced choices that would determine whether that truth continued being told. The board member representing Eleanor's descendants spoke first. "We've spent a century trying to address what Nicholas Biddle did. We've educated thousands of visitors, distributed millions in scholarships, created models for historical accountability. Maybe that's enough. Maybe we can let the building go while preserving the work in other forms." But Thomas's great-great-granddaughter disagreed. "The building is the work. These rooms, these hidden passages, this architecture, they teach things no digital archive or relocated exhibit can convey. People need to stand in the space where these choices were made, where secrets were kept and eventually revealed." Without Laurento, the story becomes abstract. The debate continued for hours, cycling through practical considerations and philosophical questions. What did preservation mean? Was saving the physical structure essential, or could the museum's mission continue in different forms? How much were they obligated to sacrifice for a building that represented both achievement and atrocity? No consensus emerged. The board scheduled additional meetings, commissioned more structural assessments, delayed the inevitable decision. Meanwhile, the building itself was failing. The third-floor ballroom, where Eleanor's funeral had been held, was now closed to visitors due to ceiling instability. Water damage had worsened in the conservatory. The hidden study, that crucial archive of Nicholas Biddle's schemes, required expensive climate control that the museum could barely afford to operate. Dr. Chen walked through Laurento late one evening, documenting the deterioration. She had directed the museum for 28 years, had shaped its transformation from simple historical site to leading institution for accountability education. The thought of losing it was devastating. In the entrance hall, she looked up at the painted ceiling with its allegorical figures: commerce, industry, culture, family, still gazing down with their ambiguous expressions. The plaster was cracking. The gold leaf was flaking. Even the symbols of permanence were proving temporary. She understood then what perhaps needed to be understood. Laurento had always been fragile, its perfection always an illusion maintained through tremendous effort and cost. Nicholas Biddle had built it to project eternal power, but nothing was eternal. Thomas had exposed its secrets, but even truth required maintenance, required each generation to choose whether to preserve or abandon it. The mansion was dying. The question was whether its lessons would die with it.